Welcome to Concussion Talk Podcast. I'm Nick Mercer. This is episode 56. Concussion Talk Podcast is presented by HeadCheck Health. HeadCheck Health bridges the gaps in concussion care through simple, powerful technology. Join organizations like the Canadian Football League, Track Factory Racing, the Canadian Junior Hockey League, Eastern Washington University, and Volleyball Canada, who rely on HeadCheck Health to improve communication and optimize care. Visit headcheckhealth.com for more. For episode 56, I'm talking to Charli Skinner and about attitude, brain injury, attitude after brain injury, post-concussion syndrome, dysautonomia, and a host of other issues, and access rehab and brain injury awareness. But first, I will ask Charli to explain what happened to her injury. How did that happen?
Hi, thanks for having me, Nick. So I actually sustained my brain injury in September 2018, so it's about a year and a half ago now. I'm a very active person, but I actually got my injury in the bathroom. I fell in the bathroom and I hit my head on the edge of a glass shower screen quite strongly. So essentially quite a bad fall. I was at home, but basically straight away I knew that something was wrong. I was in a lot of pain. I noticed that as soon as I opened my eyes after the fall, I'd lost my vision and I wasn't able to really stand up or move around. I was experiencing really severe dizziness and thought that I was going to pass out. So basically, I was taken to hospital with fears of a brain bleed, mainly in relation to the fact that I'd lost my vision. So I could still see, but I had really, really severe visual deficiencies in terms of being able to see clearly, double vision, all that kind of thing. So that was the main concern initially at the hospital, to check for brain bleed that may have affected my visual functionality and structural issues in my brain. But I actually got taken quickly to have a CT and an MRI scan and was quite quickly discharged after those because there wasn't any evidence of any structural damage to my brain on that scale. So one thing I think that's important to note with concussions is that there is some evidence of structural damage, but it doesn't show on MRI scans or CT scans, which are much sort of higher level for identifying things like brain bleeds. Yeah. I mentioned concussion, and the reason why is because I was diagnosed with a concussion at the hospital and essentially discharged and told to rest until my symptoms passed. Go home, rest, make sure that you don't do too much, don't kind of interact cognitively with too much, kind of stay in a dark room, all that kind of thing, which is we now know, or I now know as well, is quite old-fashioned advice for concussion recovery. So I unfortunately, it became evident after a number of weeks that I fit into a category of prolonged concussion symptoms, which was diagnosed after about a month and a half as post-concussion syndrome. This is something that I had absolutely no idea that existed. I have in my past, as have many people, I think, who have concussions. In fact, nearly anyone you talk to has probably experienced some level of concussion in their life. So I had experienced probably 10s to 20s of concussions over the previous years in sport, whether that was kind of skiing or sailing. I've been hit in the head by a boom before and been knocked out, and all of these things had happened over the years, but none of them had ever resulted in anything more than a couple of days of sickness or exhaustion, for example. Yeah. And so this was a whole new world for me. I'd been kind of quickly dismissed out of hospital, told I had a concussion, which I perceived to be quite a minor thing. But little did I know until it happened to me that it actually is it actually is classed as a brain injury. Yeah. And the classification of concussion is more about the functionality of your brain rather than the structural aspect of your brain. And having been through this kind of brain injury recovery since a year and a half ago and is still going through it, it's something that is really important for me to share my story and help people understand that concussion can be very severe in terms of its effects as a brain injury, and the functional aspects of your brain trying to navigate through the recovery from concussion when you have post-concussion syndrome is a very complex thing that can affect people for quite prolonged period of time. So, I mean, basically,
that's great. Sorry, you want to add something else?
no, I was just going to say
Okay.
that I have a lot to say about the different kinds of effects
Yeah.
that concussion has had on me and others, and we can go into that in a bit more detail in
Yeah.
a minute.
Well, that's great. Well, yours, as you just alluded to, you're an adventurer, kind of a skier, a sailor, and any other sports that you played steadily, frequently, like or just sailing and skiing, where obviously you take up a lot of time. But was there any other sports you were involved with, or
Yeah, so as a kid, I was heavily involved in sports at school, contact sports and team sports. I did also a lot of individual stuff, so anything from swimming to hockey,
yeah,
and but those kinds of team sports that you play at school. And then as an adult, I'd say skiing and sailing are my two biggest sports. Sailing in the summer, skiing in the winter, both of which are pretty high impact, quite high demand, and I do them. I've done a range of different types of sailing and types of skiing, but from inbound stuff to all sorts of kind of fun adventures like climbing
yeah.
mountains, skiing
Ah,
down.
ah,
And I had actually previously experienced a concussion, maybe just a year before my recent one that caused me this post-concussion syndrome while I was skiing in a really bad fall. But it didn't have anywhere near the same kind of effects immediately as this one had.
right. Okay, well, that's kind of leads us into. I was going to ask you about it was just that you were these skiing and sailing and any of the sports you play used to do frequently, but now there's more challenges to you. There are different challenges you find you have to manage and symptoms of post concussion syndrome and dysautonomia. Would you like to talk about your dysautonomia, your post concussion syndrome, and what's it Ehlers-Danlos syndrome,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
how exactly? Well, okay, first of all, what is Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and what can Bill expect? What did you not what did you find happened to you with post concussion and dysautonomia and all these? How did you meet the challenges that you face? What kind of
Yeah.
challenges do you face?
So I think if I start with some of were asking about some symptoms. So
Yeah,
in terms of, I'll start with some of the symptoms and where it sort of led me to then get the access to medical support and professionals that then diagnosed me with the two conditions that I now have, or I have had but wasn't aware that I had initially. And so in terms of symptoms and the challenges that you face, I think there's a whole host of symptoms that you face. Symptoms that you face after concussion, and when you have post-concussion syndrome, they go from I mentioned vision loss to balance issues, to feeling dizzy all the time, to having really severe nausea as a result of the combination of these different factors playing into one another. Fatigue is a really, really severe issue that a lot of people face as a challenge with concussion. And that is a kind of a fatigue that is much more severe than it ever is with someone who's healthy. I mean, I have experienced fatigue in the past from overdoing lots of activities, but ever since my brain injury, fatigue is a whole new thing
yeah, it's different, isn't
that
it?
completely floors you to the
Yeah,
point that you're basically dysfunctional. So in terms of how those kinds of things, I mean, that's a short list of many, I think. In terms of the way these symptoms affected me and the challenges I faced, initially my ability to basically function completely deteriorated. So I was unable to communicate or converse with people for more than about 10 minutes at the time.
mm,
And that's partly because cognition was a really difficult thing for me to
yeah,
to be able to, I didn't have any cognition essentially.
Right.
So I wasn't really able to remember and recall information, and my attention was in really severe deficit.
It's hard to really carry on a conversation.
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
your body is just trying to function, let alone trying to do the additional things like the pleasure that humans have of communicating with one another.
Yeah.
That is seen as an extra thing that's not really needed when your brain
Yeah.
is in that turmoil, I guess.
Exactly.
And so I didn't really have energy to even shower. I wasn't able to prepare food for myself, let alone even think about doing anything else in my days. So I was really, really barred down to very basic function for a long period of time.
Right.
I mentioned balance as well, and that was quite a
Yeah.
bad issue for me because I had quite severe vestibular dysfunction. So the vestibular system is the balance system for anyone listening to this who might not know what I'm referring to.
Yeah.
I know there are lots of acronyms and names for things that you become very familiar with when you
Yeah.
have something, but for other people, they might not know. So yeah, I had really bad balance issues and wasn't really able to walk in a straight line, which was
Yeah.
funny at times, but also quite, not really
Annoying.
ideal for doing
Yeah.
anything. And quite a risk for falling and things like that, which was the last thing I would want to do, having already
I hear ya.
sustained a head
I hear
injury.
you. Yeah. Preach to the
if
choir
you
here.
think about the way that in terms of the challenges, if you think about a sort of so-called healthy brain with full functionality, it works with default, whereas a post-concussive brain like mine that was injured went right back to basic sort of survival mode, which I think I was stuck in for a long period of time. I basically, as a result of that, lost my ability to be active. And as we said, that's quite a big part of my life prior to my injury. These kinds of symptoms that you're experiencing render you unable to sort of do much movement. And that links into a couple of the conditions that I discovered that I now have
Right.
as well. I really wasn't able to do a lot. But what I did in terms of facing those challenges was I got to a point after about a couple of months after my injury when the advice from the doctors hadn't really worked. The kind of advice to rest
Yeah.
until you
Dark room.
get
Yeah.
better. It didn't work. So I thought,
Yeah.
okay, there's got to be something else that I can do. There have to be other people in the world suffering from these issues who might be able to share and help me face the challenges. So I started to research, which was quite difficult because my cognitive function was so low.
Yeah.
So, looking at a computer was extremely difficult. So I would kind of do it in 5-minute chunks. And initially that would mean, let's say 20 minutes per day of reading was all I could do. And I slowly built that up. But I started to research the kind of symptoms that I was experiencing. And I saw a lot of familiarity with some of the issues that I felt that I had in terms of being active and getting up and about.
Yeah.
And so the first thing I did was go to the doctor and really fight for some referrals to specialists. I got access to various different specialists over the next sort of 6 months post-injury. The first two were vestibular specialists and a neuropsychiatry specialist.
Oh, that's
So
good.
they were able to help me with my balance issues
Yeah.
kind of from the outset, which was great. That kind of helped to manage one of my quite severe symptoms that would then allow me to see with a clearer picture what other symptoms I was dealing with, because there is a point at which you're dealing with so many symptoms that you can't differentiate between any of them, and finding the root cause of any of them is extremely difficult as a result of that. So in some ways, having access to sort of multidisciplinary professionals really helps, because you can, as well as siloing different issues, for example, balance, and then dealing with those, you can also see how they interrelate to one another. And so that was my biggest goal while I was, fully signed off work, trying to recover, was getting access to medical professionals who could help me with these things. So, I mentioned vestibular therapy. That was really important. And then neuropsychiatry was another thing that was really important, because they helped me come to terms with the fact that I had experienced quite a severe injury that would affect my life very significantly. They helped me overcome the challenge of dealing with these daily difficulties, and sort of a very difficult thing for people to do when you are so severely disabled is to accept where you are and to
Yeah.
kind of, accept that your condition is the way it is, but there are certain things you can do to manage it. That's a huge hurdle to overcome. And I think the neuropsychiatry support that I had through cognitive behavioral therapy was huge in that aspect of things. And that was
Right.
really, really important for kind of getting access to that near the beginning of my recovery was really important, because otherwise I wouldn't have had the kind of mental capacity or strength to move forwards or deal with
Right. Yeah.
being essentially quite severely disabled for a prolonged period of time. And then,
Yeah.
so you mentioned dysautonomia, and that's
Yeah,
another.
you mentioned. Yeah, sorry. You're saying that because you used to be as we were saying, a sailor and a skier, just an adventure. And so how did dysautonomia and what's it, Ehlers-Danlos? Can you first just mention what that
Ehlers-Danlos
is?
syndrome, yeah.
What is that?
Yeah, so basically, after I'd had access to these other therapies and other rehabilitation treatments, it was quite clear that there were some underlying issues still going on. And so one of them was nervous system dysfunction, which is what people refer to as dysautonomia.
Okay.
So essentially, while I had other issues like balance and visual issues, I also had my body had gone into a really high stress and trauma response mode after the brain injury. And basically, the kind of automatic functions that your body does, including things like blood pressure and heart rate regulation. So that relates to things like blood flow and oxygen flow to the brain and other organs, temperature dysregulation, normal digestion, and hormone regulation don't function properly.
Yeah.
And
No, I did actually did a podcast with Lauren Zayak's Phoenix Concussion Recovery podcast. Episode 10, she talked about dysautonomia the whole time. So I'm familiar with the. But what symptoms did you face? That you
Yeah,
were
so I
done
faced all of those symptoms,
the heart rate
and
and blood
that's when
pressure.
it kind of became clear to me that, and also the medical professionals that I was seeing at that point, in terms of the neurologist specialist that I was seeing, it became clear to me and then that there was still something underlying, and so I was diagnosed with dysautonomia. So basically,
Yeah.
I was having issues with all of these things,
Yeah.
and the main thing that, as I mentioned earlier, that was affected by that was my ability to be active. So a
Right.
lot of the kind of blood flow issues, temperature regulation, digestion, all of those things affect your general bodily function. And but one of the really most significant symptoms for me was the heart rate dysregulation. And as someone who
Right. Yeah.
was active as a sailor and a skier,
Yeah.
and someone that went to the gym a lot before my injury, it was the slightest movement would cause me really, really high heart rate peaks, nearly
Oh yeah.
to the point I would nearly faint. They'd make me feel really sick. I was unable. My heart rate would kind of go out of control,
Would it
and
fluctuate? Would it go up and down, or would it just go up?
it would go up and it would stay up, even if I'd gone, if I stood up, for example, or if I went for a
Yeah.
walk
Yeah.
initially. So yeah, my ability to be
Wow.
active was really, really impeded by that. And essentially, after doing a lot of research and speaking with doctors, they explained to me that one of the kind of core things to treat dysautonomia is actually, ironically, exercise. So one of the things that is the most difficult thing that I've dealt with was not being able to be
Yeah.
active, but at the same time, it was the thing that had to treat it. So, I mean, I have over a year and a half worked really hard to return to exercise. I went from walking for 10 minutes outside a day, because that was the capacity I had, to just recently, it's now 18 months, and I have just recently completed a Atlantic crossing. I sailed across the Atlantic.
Nice.
Just
Jeez.
last week, I was skiing, and I was able to sort of manage my days and climb some mountains. And
Yeah, I saw you're in Georgia, right?
exactly, yeah,
Yeah, I
I was
saw
in
it on
Georgia.
Instagram.
It's
Yeah.
a great place for skiing. I would definitely recommend it to anyone.
It's Georgia,
Uh,
Europe, not Georgia, the U.S. Georgia,
yeah,
Europe.
Georgia next to Russia and Turkey. So yeah, in terms of how it affected my sort of passions and my daily life, it was very significant. But it it took a lot of hard work, a lot of kind of adhering to exercise protocols so that you don't overdo the line at which your symptoms threshold is, so that you're not kind of booming and busting constantly. So it did take me probably a year to figure that cycle out.
So it's never like as a current. Okay, I got to sleep for this hour. I have to take a break at 4 p.m. whatever. You would just judge. You'd have to judge yourself. You know, when you're feeling not good, you have to take a break. You have to eat something or rest or do whatever.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's very much about the management and the looking at the overall picture. When you're fully healthy, you can kind of be like, I feel like I want to exercise, and you go and exercise, and it doesn't really necessarily affect your day hugely in any way. Whereas for someone who's dealing with brain injury recovery, but also has another condition caused from it, the dysautonomia, it's a whole other host of management of your daily activity, how good you feel. It's forgoing different types of activities, and maybe also actually just forgoing that sometimes on the bad days, fully forgoing the treatment and the rehab that you have to do because you need to fully rest.
Yeah.
And so then you mentioned the EDS, or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
Yes.
And this is another thing that relates into my recovery. So over the time that I was having various different types of tests done for my autonomic nervous system function, the doctor that I was seeing also identified that I had some symptoms that are related to this underlying disease, which is actually a genetic disease. But it is actually more frequently being linked to people who have post-concussion syndrome and also dysautonomia. And the reason for that is because EDS is a disease of the connective tissue. And so basically it affects blood vessels, bone, and skin. And people who have EDS are more likely to experience high levels of pain, but they're also more likely to experience nervous system dysfunction because of the various effects that the disease has on your body and the overall function of your body. So it was a very interesting thing for me to be diagnosed with these conditions, because although they're long-term conditions, they provided a huge amount of clarity and validity to the reason that I was experiencing different symptoms. They helped explain that essentially my injury combined with some underlying issues and the fact that my body had been so deconditioned from such heavy stress and trauma response to everyday input kind of created this perfect storm that it had to overcome and that I had to figure out how to deal with.
Exactly.
So I think
the
way they all link in is something that I initially really could never have understood the extent to which it all makes sense. And I think that's something that is difficult when you're first overcoming and dealing with recovery, is that a lot of it doesn't make sense because you don't have the information. But once you do get the information and you get the access to different medical professionals that can provide advice and give a picture of the bigger picture of what you're dealing with, it provides a huge amount of clarity and it helps you move forward in your recovery a lot more easily.
Yeah, no, I mean, because one of the reasons I contacted you, I wanted to speak to you is about, I think your attitude just is incredible, and I just wanted to, because I think it's because now that as you listen to you talk, that it's supposed to be because you're so informed and know exactly what's going on and how information is power, really, and I want to actually just mention that I watched a thing by a speech by Simon Sinek, and he talks about nervousness versus excitedness. So about how athletes, like Olympic athletes, before a race, they're all saying, the journalists come up and say, "Are you nervous?" They say, "No, I'm excited." And there's a link in my description of this article of this podcast to that video. But it's the thing. Like, that's just, you're trying to say you're going to approach it with an attitude of interest or excitement, or not of fear. And you haven't approached it with an attitude of fear, and maybe that's naturally from your adventurous spirit. But I mean, it lends well to the way you can see and know that you have to, even if you have just to come at these adventures and working out more aggressively. Maybe it's not always you have to just take a break and and rest, and you're not afraid of that. Just
Yeah.
taking a step back and just
Yeah.
saying, okay, today is not the day, or this minute
Yeah.
is not the minute. And
I completely agree. Yeah. I
yeah,
think
so
information is like, as you say, information has a huge amount of power
yeah,
to provide an individual with the tools. It empowers them to make decisions about what they're doing that are informed, but it also empowers them to understand what they're going through.
exactly.
And that's a huge part of my journey. I think I initially had that fear that you're talking about.
Yeah,
It wasn't a sense of excitement or a challenge. It was very much, I'm terrified that this
yeah.
is
What am I
happening
gonna
to
do
me.
now? What's
Yeah,
happened
what
with
will
my
I do?
life?
Will my life ever be the same? Will I ever
Exactly.
return to these things that I can do? And I genuinely, at one point, thought that I never ever would.
Yeah,
But firstly, as things began to improve, but secondly, as I had access to the professionals and the information, that all fed into then create the perfect recipe for recovery. And then I think a huge aspect of that, which is something I haven't talked about yet, is the community around brain injury recovery
I see.
and the
Yeah,
community around invisible illness and invisible disability that help create that kind of safe environment to allow you to sort of gain from your recovery and to approach your recovery in not necessarily a positive way, because I think the constant messaging that you have to think positive is not necessarily realistic, but
exactly. Yeah,
to approach it in a
I'm with you.
hopeful way and in a
Yeah,
way that you accept the
optimistic
days
way.
that things aren't going well and you take that step back, but you know that if you do that, that will empower you and allow you to do things in the future that you probably wouldn't have been able to do if you didn't have that kind of approach, but also the access to the information.
Yeah,
Uh,
because actually, I wanted to ask you about the. You were saying it helps you understand information, helps you understand what you're going through, and you want to help people who maybe don't have the ability, who brain injury affected them in ways that they are not, or early on they can't take, their cognitive abilities are not there to understand to really see they understand what their situation, but that you want to get out, reach out, you put a lot of effort now into reaching out to people who are and
yeah.
suffer from invisible illnesses or brain injury or any condition in the community involved. So can you talk about how you are reaching or what you have to do, what you think is important for people reaching out to do this, to deal with invisible injuries and invisible not really injuries, illnesses, and conditions, really?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a huge part of what I'm trying to do now is using the community that I found that initially helped me because I was initially kind of in the dark about what was going on. And until I had access to a community of other individuals who were actually going through the thing you're going through, it was very difficult to come to terms with it and to also feel as though you weren't alone or isolated, which is a huge aspect of recovering from a brain injury because you are so incapacitated. So not
Yeah,
only are you incapacitated, but you also think that no one else is dealing with what you're dealing with,
yeah,
partly
that's
because
tough.
the medical professionals don't necessarily share that with you. And so I benefited hugely from a community online initially because I didn't have the capacity to do anything in person. So through Instagram, for example, and people who blogged about their recovery, I started to discover different people who had already gone through or were at later stages of their recovery. And so the first thing that community helped me do was access information that helped me do research and go to my doctors with to ask them questions and all these kinds of things. Or, for example, even recommendations of specific doctors were the kinds of things that I could access from this community. And then as time's gone on and as I have gone through my recovery and as I've been diagnosed with various conditions that are more long term and will affect me in the longer term, I've then shifted into a position where I'm trying to raise awareness, firstly between friends and family and other people I come across who may not have been affected by illness or disability in their life and so are probably just quite sheltered from it in a similar
Or
way that
just
I
don't know
was.
what they have.
Yeah. I mean, so it's helping people either people who are actually going through the same kind of recovery or underlying issues, or they may have a disability, or they may have a chronic illness, and they're looking to kind of other people that can show solidarity or understand what they're going through. But there's also a huge class of people that have never had any exposure to people like that in their lives. And so there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done to raise awareness of the effects of disability and chronic illness on people, individuals, as well as society. And that's a big part, I think, of the community, not only just the post-concussion syndrome community, but also the disability or the chronic illness community. And so that's a really big part of what I'm trying to get into now. I've learned a huge amount. I learn more every day from different things that people share and conversations that I have with people. And I think people can only benefit in the long run from better awareness, and then they can then be in a position where they can be well informed and help to create more accessible environments, whether it's financially accessible, physically accessible, mentally accessible, or spatially accessible. I mean, the list goes on and on. But there is a lot of work that needs to be done for that. And I think it's amazing to kind of be a part of that community and see the people who are doing that work, and then also to try and to some extent do that work myself. So yeah, that's
no, it's very difficult because, as you mentioned, you have a raft of challenges stemming from your brain injury, and I have the issues coming from mine too. But people want to. But there's so many different issues that people face. Like, because, for example, one of my biggest issues is balance. So I need a rail to go upstairs and downstairs and things like that. But then there are people who are brain injured who can run, but just can't. Their cognitive abilities are limited, and so it's harder. You don't. There's nowhere to really meet in the middle. That I have a brain injury. I have a brain injury. It's not the same thing to everybody. They think they try to classify it, and then people encourage them to classify it, to find their niche, to be like, okay, well, come visit. Our group it deals with mental issues, and our group deals with balance issues. And you think that you fit in one of those groups, so you don't entirely fit in either one of those groups. You fit in kind of you fit in in the middle in both groups, kind of semi in like
absolutely.
So it's difficult to really, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think one of the biggest issues is that the way that disability is viewed is very binary.
Yeah.
It's viewed as something that I think quite bluntly often is viewed as something that's visual, firstly, that you can see that someone is disabled. I think brain injury is an interesting thing because it can affect you physically in a way that can be visible for people, but it can also, in a very, very big way, affect you in ways that aren't visible, but are still physical. And people have issues with understanding that you cannot look at someone and ever know what they may be dealing with, whether it's health-wise or anything else. And I think on the kind of disability or chronic illness or invisible injury spectrum, that can be very difficult for people to deal with. It's something that often causes dismissal. I think people experience dismissal in the workplace in terms of the severity of the issues or the symptoms that they're dealing with. I think in the medical sense that medical professionals can be quite dismissive sometimes if they're not aware of the invisible nature of your illness or your injury. And I think the list kind of goes on and on and on. But one of the biggest things is, raising awareness of those invisible disabilities, but also acknowledging that if you have a brain injury, it affects every individually differently. And as you said, you have specific issues in terms of getting up and down the stairs, as well as cognitive issues. I have issues that I still deal with a year and a half down the line, and some of them are less severe than others. Most of them are invisible. But different people have a different experience of all these things. And the more people can understand that it varies from person to person, and that if someone is sort of saying that they have a disability, to accept that and try and reach out to help people and provide support and provide accessible environments in all kinds of ways, then that can only help things get better in the long run.
Actually, on your Instagram today, you did a little quote about commuting to work, and the coronavirus. Was that you?
Yes, that was me.
Yes,
so
thought so. Yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of highlighting the point that people with disabilities are frequently requesting accommodations, let's
For
say, for
years
example, in the
now. Yeah.
workplace, and
Yeah.
just that essentially now that we're facing an issue that affects everyone, there's a lot more kind of focus on providing flexible working environments, and that's something that disabled people, sort of irrelevant of the context of, let's say,
Yeah.
current health emergency in
Yeah.
the world,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that disabled people face every single day and are constantly battling to try and
Yeah.
get access to flexible working environments, to remote working environments, and to accommodations that allow them to actually kind of contribute to a job in their full capacity.
Yeah,
And
like
so,
understanding of society in general, of what it means to be have a, because people don't see it, like you said, it's invisible injury, so people don't see it, they don't believe you have it, think you're just being lazy or just too tired to come to work or couldn't be bothered or whatever. But if you have an actual invisible injury, like brain injury, and you're mentally or physically unable to get to work or just interact with society as normal as everyone else would, then it's not looked upon as well as it should be, really.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, well, actually, I hope I didn't miss anything in this discussion. But before, if I did, you can bring it up now because I'm gonna ask you first of all, not first of all, I'm gonna ask you last of all, and ask you to talk about your you crossed the Atlantic. You said you sailed across the Atlantic, and you brought
Yes.
that up earlier. And I'm reading their headway.org.uk article. It's a great article by that you wrote or you were interviewed for. Um, you wanted to go across the Pacific as a dream of yours as well. But
Yeah.
can you talk about the crossing of the Atlantic and when was it and where to where and all that,
Yep.
and just the fun stuff that is. And if I did forget anything to mention anything, or you want to bring anything up that I did not bring up, then please go for it. But
Of course. Well, I mean, so yeah, I crossed the Atlantic. I sailed across the Atlantic in December 2019, so only a couple of months ago now.
okay, so
Um,
well after your brain injury.
yeah, so it was well after my brain injury. It was the first time that I've ever done anything of that scale, on
Did
a
you do it
sailboat.
alone? Did you do it alone?
I did it with four other people, with
Okay,
my family and two other very close friends.
good.
It was interesting because it was a goal of mine to do and to be able to
Yeah.
join this crossing, but I was absolutely terrified to do it because I thought that my brain injury would
You mean
hold me
excited?
back. It was that we talk about that fear turning into excitement. So what initially happened was I was extremely scared to go because
Yeah.
I thought that my brain injury symptoms and the kind of management of my daily condition and all that kind of thing would kind of be an obstacle basically to doing
Actually,
it. I thought that it might actually make me worse.
can you just mention what you did? Like what symptoms do you find or do you deal with across
Yeah,
the
so
Atlantic?
in terms of the crossing, things I was most worried about, but fortunately managed to deal with, were firstly my balance issues.
Yeah,
So
of course.
my
Yeah.
balance combined with my visual deficiency cause quite a severe level of sickness and nausea and dizziness that can
Okay.
be, once it gets to a certain point, it's very difficult to get it back to a baseline. And so my biggest worry was that I was going to get on the boat and that I, having never been seasick in my life before, would basically be really ill the whole time and not be able to
Yeah.
do anything or
Yeah.
enjoy it or
Yeah.
contribute.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I didn't have that issue, and I think that is hugely down to one of the therapies I mentioned earlier, which was the fact that I had access to a comprehensive vestibular therapy program that was a
Nice.
weekly intensive program for about 3 months before I did the crossing.
Oh, so you prepared for that.
Yeah, so I did loads of exercises,
Good.
day in, day out, to get myself to a point where I could walk in a straight line without falling over.
Yeah.
But actually where I could be more active and do more dynamic things, and my brain and my body would be able to kind of predict how to react to certain situations, so that when I would cross the Atlantic, it would become a bit more like second nature rather than working really hard. So that was one of them. And then the other one was sleep. which is obviously, I mean, you know, and
Yeah.
many others who may listen to this
Yeah.
know that sleep is one of the most core important things for recovery and for managing a kind of baseline of functionality. When you're recovering from a brain injury, it's the only time that your brain can fully shut down and kind of get back to square one, I guess, after the day. And I was really concerned that my sleep would be hindered by the rocking of the boat and all these kinds of things. And, you know, when you're out in the middle of the ocean, it's very noisy. The boat's moving around, there's lots of things crashing about, there's big waves, all these kinds of things. So I was really concerned about that as well.
Again, exciting though.
Yeah, very exciting. So, I mean, fortunately, the crew that I was with were partly my family and then others, close friends that I felt very comfortable kind of being open about what the issues that I would have would be. And they were really, I think that like it comes down to that communication, that if you communicate with people what your difficulties are, they'll do everything they can to help. And so we made sure that there was kind of, once we got into the routine, we got into it, but we put a routine together that worked for everyone, including me, to allow me to sleep and to allow me to take rests when I needed to, and to allow me to, you know, make sure that I'm taking my medicine at the right time and all these kinds of things. So there are a few, you know, I'm talking about kind of practical measures that I had to put in place to make sure that the crossing went well. But overall, as you say, it was a huge adventure. It was one of the most epic things I've ever done. I really want to do it again. I'd love to sail the Pacific. I have all these plans for the future to do it on my own boat. And I think the kind of message that I would say to people coming out of that is, obviously there are things to do with your health condition that may affect your ability to do these things. And I'm not saying that everyone has the access or the ability to do something like cross the Atlantic, but I did have the fear that was very much in place. And once I overcame that, and I figured out a way that to manage my approach to the adventure and to the crossing, everything became a lot easier. And it just became a really big adventure rather than something that I saw as an obstacle. That would be something that I might miss out on, and I'd be very sad if I'd missed out on it. So I think that was definitely a turning point in approaching it in that way. And then having done that, I now feel, you know, wow, I did that. What else could I do?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's the case for anyone when you do something fun and exciting that's, a big challenge. It creates that little fire where you're kind of like, oh, that was fun. What's next?
Yeah, If I can do that, then what's summoning me to do this?
Exactly. Yeah. So I think, if anyone who has post-concussion syndrome, there are days when you feel that you can't do and you never will do things again. But it's been, a year and a half, which in the grand scheme of things isn't much, but as time goes and when you're experiencing it feels like forever. But the more you work on things and the more access you get to rehab and the more you work with people around you, whether it's close people who can help you and support you, or whether it's people in general in the kind of, at work or in your sphere of contacts, that you work with people to kind of communicate and get the access to the support and the medical care that you need, then you will only hopefully improve, and you will learn to live with the kinds of underlying conditions that you may have to deal with for the rest of your life, but you're able to learn how to deal with them, and everything becomes a lot easier. And then you create that space for doing more exciting things without worrying what your health might do to affect it.
That is an excellent message. Thank you so much, Dad. So I think everyone can really take from that message. That was great. So is there how let's start this way, because you said I think hopefully you said everything you went out to say, but how can people reach you or find you? I know on Instagram, but is there another way people can reach you? Or
yeah, so
where can they?
I'm slowly but surely doing more to get different ways to access people and get people to contact me. I think the best way to reach me is definitely at the moment Instagram, and my Instagram is at Charli Ski, And you can see from my name how I spell Charlie. And
C
basically
H
that,
R L Y. C H R
yeah,
L
no
I.
E on the end of Charlie. I did
No,
at one
no,
point have an E on the end, but not anymore.
no.
Probably in like some
Charlotte,
teenage
you're
phase, I
Charlotte.
decided
You're
to
Charlotte,
change my
right?
name.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's a good way to reach me. I also have Facebook, and since various different communications that I've had with different people, whether it's the Headway article or other talks that I'm doing, Facebook is a good way to reach me as well, and I have the same name on Facebook.
Okay,
Um,
Charlie
but
Ski.
yeah, I think that's the best way, and I welcome anyone that reaches out. I have been that person that reaches out to people, and I still do reach out to people. So I think that we can all benefit each other from that contact and creating the community or making it bigger.
Well, thank you. That was great, and I hope you actually stick around. I'm going to start recording soon, but I hope you stick around because once I do it, just to talk to you for a few seconds. But I'm going to start recording now, and thank you again for being part of this podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for listening. Please visit my website at concussiontalk.com, and please follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook at Concussion Talk, and on Patreon, patreon.com/concussiontalk. I hope you listen again soon. As always, music at the beginning of this podcast is by Ben Sound, www.bensound.com.